This is Jed Disler, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I want to invite you to subscribe to the Piano Maven through my Substack page, and I've provided a link to do so in our episode description. Subscribers get a free download at the start of each month, and usually I give you a rare piano item from my vast collection of recordings. I'm also open to suggestions about what you would like to have for a download of the month, so please reach out to me. But your paid subscriptions help keep this podcast alive and afloat, so I thank you in advance for subscribing. So today is Monday, January 5th, and it's actually the birthday of three famous pianists, Alfred Brendel, Maurizio Pollini, and Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli. I thought I should just acknowledge that triumvirate of piano players, but today's episode is all about the Chopin Barcarolle, and this is a topic I've been putting off for some time. I wanted to do an episode about the Barcarolle while I was in the middle of the Chopin competition in Warsaw this past October. And when I was in Warsaw, of course, I was talking to so many pianists and piano lovers, and they were asking me to recommend recordings. And when it came to the Barcarolle, people were always asking me, "Oh, what's your favorite recording of the Barcarolle? What one do you recommend?" And I think if you've known me for some time, and if you followed Ben Laudy's Chopin podcast last year, and if you've read my writings, you probably know what my favorite Barcarolle is, and you can answer that question. But I will be talking about notable recordings of the Barcarolle in a little bit. But first, I want to put the piece in a kind of context. In Chopin's time, Barcarolles basically were lilting operatic gondolier songs that would sometimes materialize in the popular piano pieces of the day. You know, you'd get this innocuous salon piece that you could sight read at home called the Barcarolle at Night or the Barcarolle, whatever. And in the case of Chopin, he actually got bitten by the Barcarolle bug rather early in his composing career. There's an early piece of his called the Souvenir de Paganini, and later the Nocturne in G major, Opus 37, number 2, forgive my beautiful singing there. This actually is a bona fide Barcarolle, and I actually consider this Nocturne to be a kind of prototype for the actual Barcarolle Opus 60 that we're going to be talking about. And in the Chopin Barcarolle Opus 60, his feeling for this genre would completely blossom, full flower. You have a gorgeous right-hand cantilena that is sung out in thirds and sixths, and this theme dominates in the Barcarolle's outer sections, and it's steadily supported by a lilting left-hand ostinato, which is prevailing throughout the piece. Now, in the central episode of the Barcarolle, that ostinato in the left hand starts to give way to shorter and more insistent phrases, as the right hand charts much more exploratory waters. And then Chopin thickens the textures to prepare for a really triumphant recapitulation of the theme that really uses the whole keyboard. And it leads to a big final peroration that is followed by this absolutely sublime coda that's packed with dazzling polyphony and really extraordinary harmonic invention, along with these shimmering figurations and pedal effects that definitely foreshadow Debussy and Ravel. Chopin always knew how to write great codas. You think about the coda of the Fourth Ballade that's jam-packed with crazy counterpoint, or that virtuosic First Ballade coda, or, the big build-up at the end of the Polonaise Fantasy, or how Chopin ends the B minor sonata in quite a blaze of glory. Well, I think the coda of the Barcarolle probably encompasses the best music that Chopin ever wrote for piano. I mean, that's a very strong pronouncement, but I think it's certainly his best coda. But I may change my mind and say it's the Fourth Ballade tomorrow, maybe. But that Barcarolle coda really is a culmination of some extraordinarily inventive piano writing. Anyway, on to the recordings. Alfred Cortot's 1933 recording of the Barcarolle still sounds really fresh, almost 93 years after he recorded it in the Abbey Road studio in London. His basic tempo is brisk, but it never feels hectic because of the impetuous and always organic sounding push and pull of his phrasing. And one characteristic of Alfred Cortot that the pianist and writer Samuel Lippmann so astutely pointed out in an essay has to do with Cortot's strong projection of melodies and the wide dynamic trajectory with which he does so. And also, Cortot's rubatos never fall into generic patterns that you can predict, like retards at the ends of each phrase. And sometimes he will elongate a note that you don't expect him to elongate, or he will linger mid-phrase for just a split second to let an inner voice register. Anyway, this 1933 Alfred Cortot Chopin Barcarolle is a classic, and he did remake the Barcarolle in the early 1950s, but it's less technically secure and assured. Benno Moiseiwicz had two Barcarolle recordings on 78s. One was unpublished at the time, but it did turn up on CD many years later. And then there is his better-known 1939 HMV 78. And I think in these interpretations there's a little more surface elegance compared to Cortot. Although surprisingly, Moiseiwicz breaks his hands a lot and arpeggiates chords, maybe a little too much for my taste, and he pushes the central episode just a tad too much. But his coda is beautifully managed. I actually like the stereo version that Moiseiwicz recorded for EMI that came out on the Capitol label in the United States. And it also turned up on the Philips Great Recordings of the Century, the Great Pianists of the Century series, which restored his 1958 EMI Chopin disc, which is kind of hard to source now. And basically that stereo Barcarolle is a mellower performance overall, but it has gorgeous details. Of course, we cannot forget about Dinu Lipatti, and he recorded a fantastic Barcarolle that he actually did not approve for release. It only came out after his death in 1950. I have no idea why he didn't approve of it, because it's a beautifully proportioned and elegant and eloquent Barcarolle on every level. Also, we have from the late 1950s is a version that you might not expect to be on this list, but the German pianist Wilhelm Kempff gave us a very sensitive and cultivated performance of the Barcarolle on his Decca Chopin recordings. And it doesn't have Cortot's intensity, but he captures the lilt of the Barcarolle rhythm beautifully, and his balancing of lines and his awareness of how inner voices move in and out of the texture really impresses me. He does push his technique to the limits in the coda's climaxes, to be sure, but it's really no big deal. I think this is one of Kempff's most persuasive Chopin performances, and I would also put his Berceuse up there. I talked about that in a previous podcast episode. Another fine barcarolle from another pianist who was not so well known for playing Chopin was Walter Gieseking, and his version on 78s is really nice. It's a bit straight-laced compared to Cortot or Moiseiwitsch, but the beauty of tone and the colors and his subtle pedaling really does foreshadow the way that Gieseking played Debussy and Ravel. And he remade the Barcarolle on LP, Gieseking did in, I think, 1956, but that performance is really pallid compared to the version on 78s. I know that a lot of piano mavens swear by the 1957 studio recording of the Barcarolle by Vladimir Horowitz, and I understand why, because this is a superb example of Horowitz's affettuoso style with tapered phrases and all kinds of ear-catching little local details. But I have to offer a dissenting opinion. I have never warmed to this performance. I've always found the interpretation kind of contrived and lacking in continuity and kind of overdone. I actually prefer Horowitz's live 1980 version that came out, I think, in 1982 on an LP called Horowitz on Tour. I don't remember which venue this 1980 version was taken from. It may have been edited from several different concerts. But here, I think Horowitz's affectations seem to have more continuity and flow, and there are wonderful details of voicing. But, and this is a very big but, in that upward chromatic chain of trills in the coda, Horowitz hits a very exposed wrong note, and it kind of hurts because it's a very important melodic note, and it kind of ruins the build-up, the melodic build-up of the trills. And I'm kind of surprised that it got through, that this mistake was sanctioned, because there could have been an alternate take of that passage to splice in. Anyway, that's just one little fly in the ointment in a performance that otherwise I really like a lot. Finally, we're going to get into the 1960s, and there's a gorgeously sculpted and often reflective rendition of the Barcarolle featuring Ivan Moravec. And he's one of the few pianists who really takes his time in the coda rather than pushing it. And the sheer control and the contouring of his trills, I think, adds up to a real masterclass. This is a very beautiful Barcarolle with Ivan Moravec. In a similar vein, I would put the 1985 recording by Murray Pariah. It's a little less subjective than Ivan Moravec, but you have a similar elegance and eloquence in terms of tone production. You have more assiduous transitions from one section to the next, and wonderful contrapuntal clarity. And basically, Murray Pariah is a line guy to Ivan Moravec being a chord guy. We're back to my line guy, chord guy obsession. But Christian Zimmermann's recording of the Barcarolle from 1988, I think, shows even more emotion than Murray Pariah in regard to taking on a wider dynamic range, and there's a kind of controlled volatility that really holds my attention. And Zimmermann really takes his time in the opening measures, but once the main theme kicks in, he gets going. And also the central section really takes wing in this performance, and the phrases really move over the bar lines. Every now and then I get a hint of pre-planning or micromanaging the dynamic hairpins, but that's being picky, because Christian Zimmermann's Barcarolle is a very artistic and very original interpretation, I think, and it's grown on me more and more over the years, actually decades now. When I first heard Richard Good's recording of the Barcarolle on Nonsuch, at first I was a little disturbed by his breaking of the hands in the introduction, but once the main theme kicked in, I was really taken by how he made interpretive points through tonal shading and voicing more than through tempo adjustments, and also through a really strong interaction between both right and left hands. And I actually hear more linear interplay from Richard Good than in the Murray Pariah recording, believe it or not. And when Richard Good uses rubato, it's very, very subtle. He's a classicist through and through. But I find his Chopin Barcarolle very idiomatic, and rehearing it before I recorded this episode, I was impressed even more. It's grown on me very much in the way that Christian Zimmerman's Barcarolle has grown on me. And you wouldn't think of Richard Good as a Chopin player primarily, but actually this Chopin recital disc that he did for Nonsuch, I think is one of this pianist's finest releases, in my opinion. And among recent recordings, I just adore Benjamin Grosvenor's Barcarolle. He has great sensitivity, and I really like his well-judged tempos and his transitions, and he really has an innate feeling for what this piece is about. It's absolutely first-class pianism and interpretation. And you can say the same thing about a recording that I'm not sure is on your radar, but I did mention it when I recorded my Chopin recommendations for Ben Laudy's Chopin podcast last year. And this is a recording on the Bis label with the pianist Roland Purntinen. I've returned to this recording with pleasure numerous times. Also, I recommend that you try to find a live performance from the 2009 Van Cliburn competition with the American pianist Spencer Meyer. Now, I'm sure that there are lots of live competition performances of the Barcarolle out there on YouTube from tons of competitions. Let's not even talk about the Chopin competition. But I think Spencer Meyer's 2009 performance has great distinction, and I think you'll agree with me, and you can go to the link that I've included in my episode comments. However, and for my however choice, those of you who've followed this podcast, The Piano Maven, from the beginning, or who saw my recommendation on Ben Laudy's podcast, you know where I'm going with this. My personal favorite Barcarolle of all time is the performance that Arthur Rubinstein gave at the Moscow Conservatory October 1st, 1964. This is available in both audio and video formats. It's a performance that's easily accessible, and what I have said before about controlled freedom, this is a masterclass in how to set a mood, how to affect transitions, how to project melodies so that they sing out, so that they follow a logical arch with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what Rubinstein does in the coda is just not to be believed. He makes gradual ritardando so that all of the imitative passages and inner voices speak as well as sing. And in that final passage with the right-hand decorative filigree, Rubinstein gives such beautiful shape and meaning to the left-hand melody. Da 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 dum ba da da dum da 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 dee. I mean, I can't really sing it, but it's just so touching, and I always cry when I see this part of the performance or I hear it. Now, Rubinstein has several excellent studio recordings of the Barcarolle that largely follow this interpretive game plan, but not to the same kind of ardent and communicative and emotionally generous effect as his live Moscow performance. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode.